Good evening. Good evening. Welcome all of you. Thank you for joining us today in person and virtually. My name is David Luke. I use he, him pronouns. I'm the Chief Diversity Officer here at the University of Michigan-Flint. In my role, I'm fortunate to co-chair and be a part of the Campus Cultural Events Committee that helped plan this event today. But I'd like to begin with a land acknowledgement. We'd like to acknowledge that the land we are meeting on today is the ancestral, traditional, and contemporary homeland of many indigenous nations, most recently the Anishinaabe, including Potawatomi, Chippewa, Ojibwe, and Ottawa tribal nations. We acknowledge the painful history of genocide, forced relocation, and removal of many from this territory, and we honor and respect the many indigenous people, including those of the Three Fires Alliance, who are still connected to this land. So I want to give a brief outline to the program, but first I want to thank the Arab American Heritage Council and their executive director and U of M-Flint alum, Lucine Jara, for support of this program. Lucine will take the stage shortly to introduce our panelists. Before that, I would like to introduce our interim chancellor, Donna Fry, for welcome remarks, and that will be followed by Lucine, who will introduce the panelists and the moderated discussion. So please welcome interim Chancellor Fry.
Welcome, everyone. It's great to see you all here, and I know we have people online watching as well, and so welcome to those of you online as well. Good evening. Back in October, I shared with the university community that as I watched the events unfold in Palestine and Israel, I was genuinely shaken and struggled to process what was happening, and I'm sure that experience held for many of you. I asked our campus community to provide support for each other and for our students in such a stressful time. We have done this to the best of our ability. Since then, we have seen the horrors of war bear out with disrupted and lost lives. In some cases, these may be family members and friends of yours. And for this, it is truly tragic. When we try to understand what is going on in the Middle East, it is always helpful to learn about the history and the complexity of this very volatile and beautiful region. The complexities of the three primary religions in the area, all with a common foundation, the social and cultural complexities, the regional political complexities, and the complexity of world politics and how that affects the Middle East. Today, we will not solve the current challenges of the Middle East and specifically the Palestinian people. However, I hope that we walk away from today's event with a better understanding of the history of the Palestinian people. People always say that those who fail to learn from history are doomed to repeat it. Let us listen today to the presentations of our esteemed colleagues. Let us learn from their teachings so that in our lives we may move forward and try to avoid the mistakes of the past. I thank you for joining us this evening, and please join me in listening carefully, engaging, asking questions after the speakers have made their presentations, and enjoy the event.
Thank you. So with that, I'd like to invite Lucine Jara, Executive Director of the Arab American Heritage Council, to introduce our panelists.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you, David, and thank you, Chancellor Fry, for that introduction. It's my pleasure to introduce our invited panelists this evening. Each guest will deliver about 20 minutes of remarks, and then we'll engage in a discussion moderated by our very own Lean Shadaba, the Community Outreach Coordinator for the Arab American Heritage Council. We'll be taking questions at the end of their prepared remarks and invite virtual participants to submit their questions through the Q&A function in the Zoom webinar. Now allow me to introduce our guests if you'd like to step up to the stage so I can introduce you. Dr. Juan Cole is the Richard P. Mitchell Collegiate Professor of History in the University of Michigan. He is an expert in the relationship of the West and the Muslim world within the historical context. He has appeared on PBS's Lahore NewsHour, ABC's World News Tonight, Nightline, The Today Show, Charlie Rose, Anderson Cooper 360, The Rachel Maddow Show, and many others. He has written extensively on Egypt, Iran, Iraq, and South Asia. He also has written about the upheavals in the Arab world since 2011. Dr. Cole has regular columns at The Nation and Truthdig, and has written in an online blog titled Informed Comment since 2002. He is also a non-resident fellow of the Center for Conflict and Humanitarian Studies in Doha. Welcome, Dr. Cole. Dr. Melanie Tanielian is an associate professor in the history department of the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor, and the director of the program for international and comparative studies. Tanielian is a historian of war and society, and her research and teaching interests include the social and cultural history of World War I in the Middle East, the emergence of religious philanthropic societies and their work in times of conflict, the histories of modern humanitarianism, disease, medicine, and mental health. She is currently working on a new book titled Commodifying Kindness, German Humanitarian Fantasies, Utopias, and Practices in the Eastern Mediterranean, and is concurrently conducting research in her third monograph preliminary titled Transitional Lunacy, Madness, Society, and Citizenship in a World War, 1914 to 1919, as well as co-editing a volume titled Afterlives, Remnants, Ruins, and Representations of the Armenian Genocide. Her most recent research has been supported by the American Council of Learned Society and the National Endowment for the Humanities. Welcome, Dr. Tanielian. And last but certainly not least, Muna Tareh. Muna was born in Bein Jala, Palestine. She moved to the United States at the age of 19, graduated with high honors from the University of Michigan-Flint, where she double majored in political science and sociology. Muna served as the executive director of the Arab American Heritage Council in Flint, Michigan, before she set out to pursue a PhD degree. She currently holds a master's degree in public administration from the University of Michigan-Flint, a second Master's of Arts from Columbia University in the city of New York, and is currently a PhD candidate in political science at Wayne State University. Muna's scholarly research is focused on issues concerning the reaches and limitations of the human rights discourse and the transformation of situations of oppression and anti-colonial struggles. Muna is the recipient of multiple professional and academic awards. Welcome, Muna. And now I will turn things over to our panelists to begin their presentations. Thank you.
Well, thank you for the warm introduction. Thank you all for having me here. So I've been given the task of explaining 100 years of complicated history in 20 minutes. We'll hit some highlights, let us say. This is a controversial map. In fact, everything anybody could say about this subject is highly controversial. I put it up at my blog, a decade or so ago, and then the journalist Andrew Sullivan used it at his column, and it caused a firestorm, and I think was denounced by The Economist magazine. It's a map that shows a combination of demography and politics. And that was some of the ways that it was critiqued. But we begin with the dark green everywhere. That's the British mandate of Palestine. This area was conquered by Britain from the Ottoman Empire in World War I. And when it was conquered, it was over 90% Arabic-speaking, Muslim, or Christian. There was also a Jewish minority. However, that minority had largely been established from the mid-19th century forward. It included Russian pilgrims who then came on pilgrimage to Jerusalem, to the Holy Land, and then stayed to retire there. It included some members of the Zionist movement, which was influenced by 19th century European ideas of nationalism and wanted to make the Jewish religion a platform for a nation. Whereas that idea of ethno-nationalism linked to a land and a territory was more straightforward for Italians or Germans, even though there was no Germany and there was no Italy, and people didn't speak the same language throughout those regions, and they came from lots of other places. But the imaginary was of establishing an Italy or a Germany, and then on a territory where some dialect of the language was spoken, some common culture was there. For Jewish nationalists, there was the problem the Jews were spread around the world. They had no territory. And the nationalists in the beginning weren't so particular about where they could make this Jewish state they imagined. Some thought of going to Argentina and making a state in Latin America. The British in 1905 offered them part of Uganda, which I also think would have caused a lot of trouble. But obviously, nationalism as it arose in the 19th century tied an imaginary of history to ethno-nationalism, and so Greek nationalism was very much wrought up with the lands on which the Greeks lived in ancient times, and so Zionism fixated upon Palestine increasingly as a place to go, and especially when it was conquered by the British Empire and made a kind of colony. It was called a mandate. The British, during World War I, had some crackpots on their cabinet who were convinced that the Jews ran the world behind the scenes. This is an anti-Semitic trope, but it can become philo-Semitic. That is to say, people can do things for Jews because they believe in these anti-Semitic tropes. So Lord Balfour was one of them, and he thought that the British would win the war more easily if the Jewish bankers were on Britain's side and not on those of Tsarist, not on the side of the Austrians and the Germans. And so he issued a declaration in 1917 from the British cabinet saying that the British government would look favorably upon the establishment of a Jewish state in Palestine. Or sorry, of a Jewish homeland. It was very vague. And he said, only if it wouldn't inconvenience the local people. How are you going to make a state? How are you going to make a home in somebody else's land, territory, without inconveniencing them? You know how sometimes the airlines double book a seat? They're afraid it won't be filled, so they end up selling it to two different people. Ordinarily, they offer you money to go away if they do that, and somebody gets it. But there have been instances where people rush the plane, they really want to get someplace, and then they have fist fights over the double-booked seat. That's the story of the modern Middle East. The British double-booked Palestine. They actually, in 1939, issued a white paper in which they promised the Palestinians would have a state by 1949, just as there was, after World War I, a French mandate in Syria, and the French were constrained to give the Syrians independence in 1943, and there became a Syrian state. And there was a British mandate of Iraq. The Iraqis became independent in 1932. So there was a plan for Palestine to be a state as the other mandates became states over time. And that plan was derailed by the influx of European Jews to Palestine. And that probably wouldn't have happened voluntarily. That is to say, the Zionists probably were thinking too big for reality. How could you convince Jews who were comfortable in Berlin and Paris to go off and live in Jaffa, in Palestine? Even the Jews in Baghdad didn't want to do that. But then you can hear ominous music in the background. The European fascist movements arose. and the Nazis took over Germany, and the Iron Guard became influential in Romania, and throughout Europe, anti-Semitic far-right movements came to power, and they targeted Jews. They fired them from their jobs, they attacked their shops, they started rounding them up. Ultimately, they murdered 6 million of them. And some Jews, the ones who had more wherewithal, managed to start escaping from Europe in the 1930s, but nobody would let them come in. The United States forbade their entry under Roosevelt. They couldn't get into Brazil. The British didn't want them. The British promised them a homeland in Palestine, but they didn't want them in London. So one of the few places they could go was British Mandate Palestine because of the commitment that the British government had made. And so you have this influx of hundreds of thousands of Jews into Palestine in the 1930s, and you have a civil war then after World War II in Palestine, and you end up with Israel, which is the white part. And well, no, this is the second slide is the 1947 General Assembly UN partition plan, which did not have the force of law because only the United Nations Security Council can enforce an executive action. But it was more of a proposal and very pro-Zionist in the sense that in the second slide, they gave a lot of British Mandate Palestine, and for some reason the Negev Desert, to the Zionist movement, which was actually, centered in those little white dots in the first map. And then there was a civil war in 1947 and 48, during which the Zionists, some of whom had been active in anti-Nazi resistance, some of them had served in the British Army, knew their way around military organization, weaponry, and so forth, and they established a state and defeated the Palestinians and the allies of the Palestinians fairly handily, and they expelled over half of the Palestinians from historic British Mandate Palestine. They had to go either to that larger green place, the West Bank, or to Jordan, or to the Gaza Strip, which the new Israelis did not capture, that strip of land along the Mediterranean. About 70% of the people who live in Gaza are refugees, their families are refugees from southern Israel, from what became southern Israel, and the Jewish Zionists who came to that part of the world captured their farms, their lands, their bank accounts, and expropriated them for themselves. And so the refugees in Gaza were left with nothing. They were crowded into camps and so forth. And then in 1967, the Israelis seized the West Bank and Gaza under the pretext of the 1967 war, even though the Palestinians were not involved in it. And then they began sending in settlers into this occupied territory, which is strictly against the Geneva Conventions. The Geneva Convention of 1949 on the treatment of occupied populations strictly forbids the metropolitan country from sending in its nationals to settle in occupied territory. Occupation after World War II was envisaged in international law as a short-term measure during war. Maybe one country occupies some of another country, but when the armistice comes, when the war is over, they have to give it back. According to the United Nations Charter, you can no longer seize other people's territory. The Israelis, although they're a signatory to the United Nations Charter, have never accepted this principle. And the founder of Israel, David Ben-Gurion, wrote in his diary in mid-May of 1948, when Israel was founded, that just as the United States had no designated border in the Constitution, so Israel did not. So he clearly was thinking of a manifest destiny that the Israeli state would expand. This Israeli seizure of these occupied Palestinian territories, which I understand from today's news, the New York Times reporters have been refused permission to use the term occupation. These occupied territories, but all the international law organizations and the United Nations and pretty much everybody who understands the situation understands that these territories are occupied. There was an attempt in 1993 under the Clinton administration to resolve this issue by making a Palestinian state in the West Bank and Gaza, having the Israelis withdraw from those two places and giving them into the control of a Palestinian government, the Palestine Authority. In the nature of the case at the time, the Palestine Liberation Organization and its allies would form the core of this Palestine Authority. And as part of these negotiations, the PLO recognized Israel. And so there was a chance for peace. Unfortunately, that did not come to pass. Yitzhak Rabin, the Israeli prime minister who concluded the Oslo Accords, was assassinated by a far-right individual belonging to the same stream of politics that now dominates the Israeli cabinet. And then Benjamin Netanyahu, a far-right Likud party member, came to power as prime minister. And he boasts about how he derailed the Oslo Accords. He didn't let them go forward. After 1993, rather than withdrawing from the West Bank, the number of Israeli settlers in this occupied territory doubled, 1993 to 2003. So that doesn't look like what the Oslo Accords envisaged, which was a withdrawal by the Israelis by 1997 from the West Bank. It didn't happen. And it deliberately didn't happen because Netanyahu didn't want it. The Israeli right was expansionist. They said, "Are you crazy? We're not giving it back." And then from early 2001, the right-wing former general Ariel Sharon abandoned the Oslo Accords entirely and accelerated the process of settling. The Israelis also, quite illegally, annexed part of the West Bank. You're not supposed in international law to annex occupied territories. Like Mussolini occupied Nice during World War II from France. Nice is, French Riviera is pretty nice. I don't think the Italians wanted to give it back. But, the international law grew up in reaction against these kinds of actions on the part of the Axis. And Sharon was against giving back the West Bank and accelerated the settlement there. He did withdraw from Gaza. This was not out of the milk of human kindness. There were Israeli settlers in Gaza, and the government concluded that they couldn't be protected. There were only 8,000 of them. Gaza was densely inhabited at that time, over 1 million people, and there was occasional violence about the influx of these settlers into what was already a very densely populated area and the usurpation of people's land. And so Sharon withdrew from Gaza, but he didn't do so in an Oslo framework. He didn't withdraw and turn the place over to anybody. He just withdrew, creating a power vacuum. And then George W. Bush had the great idea of democratizing the Middle East. I think he didn't find weapons of mass destruction in Iraq, and so he needed some other pretext for the US to be there. And he started putting pressure on Egypt to have elections, to real elections. And Hosni Mubarak let one of his rivals out of jail and let him run against him. And then when he was defeated, he put him back in jail. So that was the Middle Eastern response to Bush's pressure. In regard to Palestine, the Bush administration insisted that Hamas be allowed to run. And Sharon said, "Are you crazy?" And Bush said, no, it has to be democratic. And Hamas was a pro-Islam political party that opposed the secular left-leaning PLO and its allies within Palestinian politics. And lo and behold, Hamas won the 2006 elections. This was not supposed to happen. It was just for show that they were allowed to run. And then the CIA, the Mossad, and the PLO collaborated in staging a coup against Hamas. Its parliamentarians were arrested, and it was removed from power in the West Bank. And they tried to make a coup against it in Gaza, but failed. So Hamas remained in power in Gaza. You will read in the newspaper on an almost daily basis that Hamas made a coup in 2007. It shows you the state of our information system, that it's bass backwards. Hamas survived a coup in 2007. It was in the West Bank that there was a coup. Well, if there's no Oslo Accords, if there's no prospect of an Israeli withdrawal from Gaza and the West Bank, if there's no prospect of a Palestinian state, then what do you have? What kind of a situation is that where now over 5 million people are dominated by another people? The 5 million Palestinians are stateless. They have no citizenship in a state. Hannah Arendt defined citizenship as the right to have rights. Because if you don't have citizenship, what court would you go to adjudicate your rights? So the Palestinians have no right to have rights, and they therefore, a lot of human rights organizations, the Human Rights Watch and so forth, have decided, and many units of the UN have decided that Israel is now under apartheid. And that apartheid situation sets the stage now for the Gaza conflicts, of which there have been numerous. 2008-9, 2014, there was something in 2012, 2018, 2021, and now the big Gaza war. And because Hamas survived the coup of 2007, the Israelis put a blockade on the Gaza Strip and drove it into poverty, 54% unemployment, 20% of the children show signs of malnutrition and even stunting. It's an intolerable situation. The airport was destroyed by the Israelis, the harbor was destroyed. Some people have described it as the world's largest open-air prison, and it laid then the foundation for these events that have occurred since October 7th, about which I'll let our fellow panelists tell you. Thank you.
Wonderful. Great. Good evening, everyone. It's great to be here, and thank you for inviting me, and also thank you to the organizers for putting together this incredible event, and also a big hello to Ann Arbor campus, which is, I think, watching. So I am a historian of humanitarianism and human rights, and so I have the great privilege that Juan now laid out the history of the conflict for me, so I can dive closer to the ground and tell you a little bit about what is going on and the history of the current moment. So on January, I can't see here, but okay. So on January 11, 2024, 3 months into Israel's war on Gaza, which by then had already killed over 20,000 Palestinians and displaced the entire population from the northern part of Gaza, the International Court of Justice, also called the World Court, in The Hague, heard a case brought by South Africa against Israel, based on the latter's breach of the United Nations Genocide Convention, or the UNGC. A week before the hearing at the ICJ, the UN Undersecretary General, Martin Griffiths, posted on social media, "Do you think getting aid into Gaza is easy? Think again. He called for an immediate stop to the war, as the situation has become unbearable for the people on the ground. He summarized the impediments to aid. 3 layers of inspection before trucks can enter. Confusion, long queues, a growing list of rejected items, a crossing point meant for pedestrian, not trucks, and other crossing points where trucks have been blocked by desperate, hungry communities. A destroyed commercial sector, constant bombardment, poor communication, damaged roads, convoys shot as, delays at checkpoints, a traumatized and exhausted population crammed into a smaller and smaller sliver of land, shelters which long have exceeded their full capacity, aid workers themselves exhausted, displaced, and killed. South African lawyer Adila Hassim read Griffith's words into the record of the ICJ. Hassim's task was to outline Israel's acts and omissions the South African legal team deemed constituted a systematic genocide of the Palestinian people and request provisional measurements to protect Palestinian civilians. At the heart of the indictment was Article 2C of the UNGC, deliberately inflicting on a group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part. Griffith's condemnation of the obstruction and logistical failures in delivering aid to Gaza summarized Hassim's detailed account of what scholars have called starvation or famine crimes. When the court began its hearing in January, experts noted that famine was about a month away. It was in January, or it was imminent, famine was imminent. The ICJ issued a press release adding additional provisional measures actually 2 weeks ago, declaring in view of the prolonged widespread deprivation of food and basic necessities to which the Palestinians in Gaza have been subjected, and that Palestinians in Gaza are no longer just facing the risk of famine, as noted in the court's order from January of 26, but famine is setting in. Famine is projected to unfold anytime between now and May of 2024. We see famine unfold before our eyes. The question is, why has no one declared famine officially? The Integrated Food Security Phase Classification, or the IPC, that's what I'm going to call it, was established in 2004. It was an early warning system. The IPC has clearly defined famine, and it is divided in 5 phases. 5 phases is catastrophe and famine. Famine is defined as at least 20% of households facing acute food insecurity or extreme lack of food, 30% of children suffering from acute malnutrition, and the death rate due to starvation or related diseases must be 2 adults or 4 children in 10,000 every day. So that's the exact scientific measurement that the IPC has been working with. The IPC is a global partnership of 15 organizations, the goal of which is to provide decision makers really with a rigorous evidence and consensus-based analysis of food insecurities and acute malnutrition situations, to inform emergency responses, as well as medium and long-term policy and programming. So the IPC is not a declarative body in a way, but a tool that is expected to be used by governments and international bodies to issue these declarations. And while aid workers and scholars have called famine for some time now, the first US senior official, USAID Administrator Samantha Power, answered in the affirmative only 5 days ago when she was asked whether or not there was famine in Gaza. But global leaders remain hesitant to call famine as it commands a moral obligation to intervene. The crisis unfolding in Gaza experts and humanitarian organizations have warned is unprecedented in its scale, in its speed, by which it has been escalating into what we now see, this humanitarian crisis emergency, and in its pure man-made origins. According to SAIS, Gaza's entire population at this moment is categorized under Category 3, crisis, Category 4, emergency, Category 5, catastrophe or famine. This marks the highest proportion of people facing acute food insecurity ever recorded by the IPC for any single region or country. To put it into perspective, during the period from February 15 to March 15, 677,000 individuals were classified at stage 5. And projections indicate that from March 16 to July 15, around 1.1 people, roughly half of Gaza's population, will be at the level of famine. In comparison, when the famine was declared in Somalia in 2011, approximately 490,000 individuals were categorized at stage 5, while in Sudan, during the famine declaration, around 80,000 were classified as facing famine. What sets Gaza apart is that it is entirely man-made. It stems from the ongoing conflict, and in particular, Israel's blockade of aid into Gaza. While conflicts, economic factors, as well as environmental conditions contributed largely to famine in Somalia and South Sudan, Gaza's famine is the result of human action or inaction alone. According to the Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown University, or the CSIS, and others, the speed at which the humanitarian crisis has manifested in Gaza is also notable. Within just 6 months, food insecurity reached severe levels for all residents, unlike previous famines in Somalia and South Sudan, which were the culmination of prolonged conflict, drought, economic challenges over months or years. The Gaza crisis has escalated rapidly within only 6 months. I'm telling you, of course, nothing new when I say that Israel is using food and basic necessity as a tool of war, an action that has long been prohibited by international law. There are plenty of historical examples that illustrate economic warfare as a strategy to bring the internal and external enemy to its knees, from the Napoleonic Wars to the American Civil War in the 19th century, the total wars in the 20th century, the US Operation Starvation, blocking food from entering Japan during World War II, to Putin's drone attacks on grain silos, loading facilities. We can say that food sits at the heart of conflict. Scholars of war have drawn attention to everyday violence resulting from wartime blockades as a war strategy, blurring the lines of war, a truism repeated so often that it becomes a cliche. It also long has deemed famine, it also has long deemed to be a war crime to use food as a weapon. The international legal body prohibiting intentional starvation as a method of war has been expanding since its first articulation in the additional protocols of the Geneva Convention in 1977. But again, when I'm saying that Israel is using food as a weapon of war, I'm not telling you anything new. You've been watching the news. But why is it so rapidly developing, and why is it so deadly? The Center for Strategic and International Studies at Georgetown, in its comparison between the humanitarian crisis in Gaza, South Sudan, and Somalia, underscores a critical distinction. It notes that while South Sudan and Somalia have grappled with protracted conflict and civil wars leading to famine, Gaza's crisis is said to have been the outcome of this mere 6 months period, chiefly due to the draconian siege imposed by Israel's authority since October 7th, resulting in the interruption of essential humanitarian aid. On October 9th, Israeli Defense Minister Yoav Gallant ordered a comprehensive siege, blocking the entry of electricity, food, and fuel into the Gaza Strip. He could do so because Israel had constructed a matrix that controlled every aspect of life in Gaza for decades. To understand why Gaza's famine is so brutal, we don't look at the last 6 months. It is imperative actually to pause and look at some of the historical context leading up to the war. And for this, I want to return to the opening remark of South Africa's legal team from January. Before Adila Hassim took the floor, South Africa's ambassador to the Netherlands, Usi Mandosela, laid the broader framework for the case against Israel. Mandosela began, "In our application, South Africa has recognized the ongoing Nakba of Palestinian people through Israel's colonization since 1948, which has systematically and forcibly dispossessed, displaced, and fragmented the Palestinian people, deliberately denying them the international recognized inalienable right to self-determination." Ending his opening remarks, he repeats once again, "The events in Gaza inevitably form part of a continuum of illegal acts perpetrated against the Palestinian people since 1948. Israel's acts and omission," Mandosela emphasizes, "are an escalation of Israel's 25 years of apartheid, 56-year occupation, and 16-year siege imposed on the Gaza Strip. A siege," Mandosela says, UN officials have described as a silent killer of people. You see here that the legal team contextualizes its charges into the long history of settler colonialism, occupation ignored by the CSIS, that undergird really the deliberate creation of the impossible condition of life for Palestinians. To provide further context, I will zero in on the last 2 decades of siege in Gaza and try to show how today's famine, which has been avoidable according to every single aid worker on the ground, as miles of trucks are waiting, sitting at the border, is, for one, at least in part, the outcome of what Eyal Weizmann has coined humanitarian management. And if I have time, the result of a broader securitization of humanitarian aid, as shown by Lisa Bungalia in her recent book, which has tightened aid facilitation within the larger context of a global war on terror. I'm limiting my remarks to the humanitarian management of aid, as that's my area of work, but of course there's many historical works that dive deeper, like Ilan Pappé and Rashid Khalidi. So since Israel's withdrawal in 2005, as Juan just mentioned, Gaza has been subject to what amounts to a siege by Israel, cloaked in humanitarian management. The siege has cut Gaza's inhabitants off from the rest of the world by controlling the flow of goods and people through a system of permits, permissions, and checkpoints with dire economic effects. Rashid Khalidi writes, I quote, "Most Gazan depended on work in Israel or on exporting goods with stringent restriction on doing both. After 1990s Oslo, economic life underwent a slow strangulation, adding to the numbers of Palestinians in Gaza reliant on foreign assistance, which is now close to 70%, or now it's 100%. In time, support from the US, the EU, and the UN, and several affluent Arab nations who have financed the limited economic infrastructure development and provided resources for public services and emergency relief during the repeated military campaigns that Juan outlined on his slides. UNRWA, for instance, now serves 5.7 million refugees and has an annual budget of $1.4 million. So foreign aid allocation and distribution, however, are intricately intertwined with the donor state's relations with Israel and have increasingly been subjected to surveillance, a dynamic that Lisa Bungalia aptly terms security logic, or the securitization of aid, as well as humanitarian management. So what is humanitarian management? Eyal Weizmann notes that Israel's withdrawal from Gaza shifted, on the one hand, the status quo. I don't know where I have that slide. This one here. Shifted the status quo from a system of territorial control to one of humanitarian control or management, namely the control of life-sustaining resources into Gaza. Weizmann contends that humanitarianism, human rights, and international humanitarian law, when abused, by states, suprastates, military action have become a crucial means by which the economy of violence is calculated and managed. The economy of violence is calculated and managed by the abuse of humanitarian action. And for the last 2 decades in particular, he writes, Israel's humanitarian management has been calibrated based on a standard of humanitarian minimum, meaning that the calibration of life-sustaining flow of resources through the physical enclosure allows for survival, but nothing more. So what is a humanitarian minimum? International organizations like the IPC, I just showed you, have determined thresholds for starvation based on science. What a humanitarian minimum is supposed to be is unclear on the surface. Indeed, this category does not exist in international humanitarian law, or I don't know about it at least. Instead, it is a category that over time has been constructed by the Israeli government and military officials. Israel's Ministerial Committee of National Security Affairs, headed by Ariel Sharon, outlined its policy towards Gaza on September 19, 2007. This came in response to Hamas's electoral win, which in the eyes of the Israeli government, not surprisingly, considering the militant nature of Hamas and its allies, turned Gaza into a hostile territory. Besides continuing military and intelligence warfare, the National Security Committee declared, I quote, restrictions will also be placed upon the Hamas regime to the effect that the passage of goods to the Gaza Strip will be limited, the supply of fuel and electricity will be reduced, and restrictions will be imposed upon the movement of persons to and from the Strip. The restrictions will be implemented bearing in mind the legal ramifications, so they're very careful, of the humanitarian situation in the Gaza Strip in order to prevent a humanitarian crisis, end of quote. To prevent a humanitarian crisis was the bar for the minimum that was set in September of 2007. Israel's high court and military officials would eventually further define what constituted this humanitarian minimum. What is that? In response to a petition filed by a number of human rights and humanitarian organizations in October of the same year. The petition protested what the organizations saw as a siege, and internationally it already was gaining the reputation that it was a siege, a blockade, as supplies reaching the territory were well below the UN or what the UN had determined to be necessary. The Israeli court's response was that the threshold below which Gaza's residents could be harmed was not really reached yet. The court then employed experts, those are always good, to determine the humanitarian minimum and to be in constant contact with UN agencies, international NGOs, and Palestinian health officials. The goal was to monitor any indication of a humanitarian crisis. If it got too close, the flow of energy and provision was increased. And a couple of years later, a Haaretz investigative reporting team revealed the existence of a document titled Red Lines, drafted by the Office of the Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, or GOGAT. It took a year of further petitioning for this document to be released by the state. The document meticulously outlined the management of the humanitarian minimum. The caloric intake for men was prescribed to be 2,100 calories, for women 1,700, and that's well below the standard of what is recommended by our own NIH. Caloric needs were divided by food group, translated into tonnage of food, and the number of trucks needed, and it was set at 106. And you see here on the graph that 106 was not met very often. Dolph Weissglass, who was the advisor to Ehud Olmert in 2007, said the idea was to put Gazans on a diet, but not make them die of hunger. So the red line document determined what was called a breathing space, using a basic algebraic formula that you would find in your math textbook, which basically presents using sort of this basic formula that uses the food present in Gaza, divided by daily consumption needs, which results in the number of days before food runs out. And that's the breathing room. Again and again, we read that the goal is survival, but not living. And the minimum eventually was the maximum cap on provisions. Besides, of course, food, fuel and electricity and water are key, not only for survival, but also for any form of economic development. And Israel has been great at preventing any serious improvements in developing the electric grid and the water system in Gaza. Gaza has one power plant, which in the last 2 decades has been repeatedly damaged and shut down due to fuel shortages. Those of you who have family in Gaza know the drill. Electricity is on for a few hours a day. Water comes for a few hours of day at the time. A UN report from 2010 notes that the plant is producing far below its capacity, citing the EU's Commission's decision to cut subsidies, high prices for fuel that was to be purchased in Israel, Hamas's trouble to collect revenue, and its uneasy relation with the Palestinian Authority, as well as the restriction of import of what Israel deems dual-purpose materials that can be used to repair dated infrastructure, but also to build weapons, it argues. Uneven electricity means disruption of water sewage treatment, meaning that untreated sewage would be released into the environment. Electricity is also needed to pump water to households. And agricultural development that relies on water, fuel, and electricity was suffering tremendously. We also, of course, have to think about water. I'm going to skip this because I'm sure I'm talking too long, as it's always the case. But I just say that by 2017, the UN and Amnesty International reported that 90 to 95% of Gaza's water supply from the aquifer was contaminated and unfit for human consumption. So essentially, you get the picture. What I'm trying to do here. The policy of humanitarian minimum placed pressure on the entire civilian population with the goal of undermining Palestinian leadership. But these policies in the long term have also created a humanitarian crisis in waiting. The system of humanitarian management is resulting slow economic strangulation and securitization of aid allow Israel to turn on the lights, open the faucet, unlock the supply lines, or shut it all down at a moment's notice. That's why 6 months are so deadly. In short, the moral technology, and in conclusion, of a complex humanitarian assemblage of procedures, organizations, and instrument of monitoring provision, movement, and development potential over time have stacked up to exercise the contemporary violence. The cloak of humanitarianism is generous. In the press briefing already in December, Colonel Elad Gorham, the head of the Civil Department of Coordination of Government Activities in the Territories, assured everyone that his team was meeting daily with international aid agencies to not only understand the real situation in Gaza, but also to improve the method and technique of entering humanitarian aid into Gaza. At the same time, Israel's foreign minister noted Israel, together with other partners in the region, are promoting the initiative for a secure maritime corridor to facilitate the transfer of humanitarian assistance to Gaza in an organized and well-inspected manner. The keywords are organized and well-inspected, which is necessary for the collateral effects of the blockade and starvation to be calculable and not accidental, right? So you can calculate the risk. On December 5, Netanyahu exposed the aim of humanitarian management, and he has done this over and over and over again. I quote, "The war effort are supported by the humanitarian effort." So the war efforts are supported by the humanitarian effort. This is because we follow the laws of war, he says, because we know that if there would be collapse, disease, pandemic, and groundwater management, or manage infections, it will stop the fighting. If there is a humanitarian crisis, it will stop the fighting. The system of humanitarian management as it existed before the war has become part and parcel to the very logic of mass violence that characterizes Israel's strife in its war against the Palestinian. And of course, as we all know, Netanyahu is not the one that's interested in stopping the fighting. Thank you. Thank you. That's better, yeah. If you can, yeah, because I don't see that. If you can get it closer, it'd be great.
Good evening, everyone. First, I want to thank everybody, especially the organizers, for being here. I want to thank the audience for being here today. This is a very timely and much needed discussion that I think that needs to be taken up on frequently, considering the humanitarian implications and what it means for humanity at large. It's important to note that the question of Palestine is no longer a question of Palestine. It's a question that touches upon struggles from across the world, whether it's the struggles of our Black Americans, brothers and sisters, whether it's the struggle of the natives in which this university was established on, whether it is the struggles of minority communities like the Hispanic, Latino, immigrant communities. All of them resemble the struggle for Palestine. And the reason that being the case is because they all go against the dominant hegemony, the dominant discourse of the powerful narratives on the expense of vilifying and discounting the minority narratives and the narratives of anti-colonial struggles. So in so many respects, this is a subject matter that needs to be discussed over and over and over again. I can't emphasize that enough, because discussing it over and over again, especially in academic institutions, is very imperative. First, it goes against this culture of almost subordination in which that academics and student activists are right now being subjugated or being actually bullied into silence on campuses by painting them as people who support terrorism or people who are anti-Semitic. We have to keep fighting this discourse of being afraid to speak up on behalf of Palestine. Because if you're afraid to speak up on behalf of Palestine, you know, at the end of the day, it's gonna marginalize minority communities and people who are seeking to achieve what is right and what is just. So that's the imperativeness. So thank you for the organizers for putting this. Thank you for the audience for taking the time to come here this evening. It's very, very important, like I said. The other thing I wanted to mention was that I'm nervous. And this doesn't actually happen often. And the reason why I'm nervous is because I have the honor to be on the same panel with two of University of Michigan's, the nation's giants when it comes to the political discourse, when it comes to history, when it comes to international law. So to include me on this panel is very humbling and nerve-wracking is the right word. Thank you. Oh, wow. That's a good start, right? Okay. So I am a political theorist by training. Can we? No, I want to just, okay. I'm a political theorist by training. So what I'm gonna be discussing here, what I'm gonna do today is what I'm going to basically build on what Professor Juan Cole's presentation, build on the international aspect of humanitarian law and so forth, and put it in a theoretical context to help us understand what's going on in Palestine and how we can move this struggle forward. So hence my presentation is called, it's called Beyond Words. Okay, so the overarching question or thing that I would like to discuss is basically the reaches and limitation of the human rights discourse. Ever since 1948, when the State of Israel was established, the United Nations or the international community at that point framed the Palestinian question in certain ways. And today, we can say that the United Nations, for example, frames the same questions in different ways. So what are the implications of question framings? And the reason why I speak about that because question framing, language has the power, there's a performative power to language, in the sense that language in the abstract, especially in Mantis-Supori language, when we talk about the rights to self-determination, the rights to civil rights, the rights to, or civil, political, humanitarian rights, all of these questions were framed in a certain way at a certain periods of time. Initially, I was going to explain a little bit the theoretical approach of my thinking, but I think to simplify things, I'm gonna bypass that. But for me to understand what is the performative role of question framing, why should we care about how the question of Palestine is actually being framed? For example, in 1948, when the question, for example, the State of Israel was established and we had a huge first mass wave of Palestinian refugees, the United Nations framed the struggle of the Palestinian refugees as a struggle for self-determination, and the resolution 194, which the United Nations has undertaken after the events of the Nakba, basically guarantees the right of these Palestinians to go back to their home. So, but there is more to that resolution than what's at play. There's an actual material implication to that resolution. So the question becomes then, why is it that, for example, 75 years later, the Palestinian refugees of right to return, of the right of the Palestinian refugees of return was not accomplished? What makes it so hard? According to international law, the refugees' right to return is enshrined in international law in the Refugee Convention, and actually it was based on this notion of the people's notion of self-determination, right? So self-determination and refugees are two things tied to each other. For example, and in past examples, actually refugees were able, the United Nations were able to actually oversee the return of refugees, of certain refugees, for example, in Bosnia, 1992, I think. And Bosnia, I'm not sure about exactly the information right now, it escapes me, but the UN actually, oversaw the return of these refugees, regardless of the unfavoring dominant discourse at the time, of the political discourse at the time. So why is it that, for example, 75 years later, the Palestinian refugees of 1948 are not able to go back to their home? There has to be, then we have to actually try to deconstruct the reaches and limitations of the human rights discourse. Does it, for example, benefit the Palestinians to put their questions in the hands of the United Nations for them to define and manage the Palestinian question as they see fit? To whose benefit are these definitions? To whose benefits are the way that the question framing of Palestine actually benefits? And as you will come to see, the United Nations, I would argue, was actually, not only that the United Nations was actually implicit in evoking the Nakba events in 1948, and that's because it partitioned what it had no right to partition, prior to that. It partitioned the land of Palestine, giving, like Professor Cole said, giving the majority to the Israeli Jews, although there were no Israelis at that point, obviously, to the Jews, although they represented the minority of the people, rather than, and not even consulting the majority of Palestinians at the time. So they partitioned their land without even consulting with them. So first of all, the United Nations at that time, it was just had been established after the Second World War, and it had no legal authority to actually partition land. So to this day, the partitioning part is actually remains as a decision, as a recommendation of the UN, than a legally abiding UN resolution. Just so we can actually be sure to know how we are framing the question. For example, so now we're saying, but what we see that in 1967, the UN, for example, when the second Palestinian refugee, after the next day, the second Palestinian refugee question became prominent, the United Nations, we saw discrepancies between the way the United Nations defined what the Palestinian refugees are and the way it bestowed that right upon the people. So, and the reason why I chose the question of refugeehood and the notion of self-determination, because it enables us to actually trace the conceptual shifts throughout the history of the discourse of the Palestinian struggle for liberation, from 1948, when at the event of the Nakba, until our present day, and it shows their implications on the discourse of the PLO as a struggle. It shows their implications on the international community. And on the people, how the people, support, it explains the collective support that the Palestinians are able to get throughout the years. For example, you see that when I first moved to the United States in the early 1990s, just mentioning the word Palestine will raise some eyebrows, if not, accusations of anti-Semitism or whatever. But look at us now. Look at all of the cross-solidarity movements between the Palestinians and Black Americans. Look at, for example, the hundreds of thousands that are taking up the streets every single weekend in New York, in Chicago, everywhere. This was inconceivable 20 years ago. So what does the future have for us? Does the future have a liberation for us? For us to be able to evaluate that, we need to consider how the way we frame the question of Palestine affect the discourse of the liberation. And the reason why I think that needs to be a re-evaluation is, as we all see, there is increasing demand for the Palestinian, for a reform, to establish to reform the Palestinian liberation movement. They say now in recent year, which I agree with that evaluation, by the way, the Palestinian Authority, the derivative of the PLO post-Oslo, is corrupt. Its interests are becoming tied to the interests of their occupier. They don't serve the interests of the people. They serve the interests of the powerful agents that are funding their establishment. So if that's the case, and if there's a call for reform in terms of liberation strategy, then we have to learn from history, right? We have to learn how the way that we question and frame impact the way we actually choose our future strategy. So, and I will give examples to that. So initially, the notion of self-determination, it's important, which is a right that is enshrined in the United Nations Charter, and which basically a foundational pillar for the establishment of the UN itself, centers self-determination as a right for all peoples to determine their right of statehood, the kind of establish the right that the statehood that represents their political aspirations. So this, for example, explains why, since it was in its infancy stages, explains why, for example, explains why the 194 resolution, the refugee resolution, which was taken up at the onset of the Nakba, specified the right of the Palestinians to return, the right of the 1948. But if we note, but what we'll see is that there's soon to be discrepancies, contextual discrepancies between resolutions that were taken prior or at the onset of the 1948 and at the onset of the 1967 Nakba. So where in the resolutions after the 1967 Nakba pertaining to the Palestinian refugees, I mean, common sense would dictate that, the same resolution, that was taken in post the Nakba would actually apply to the refugees post the Naksa. This is given the fact that they are the same people, it's the same question invoked by the same events. So there's no reason, for example, for UN resolution to adopt different resolutions. It could have, for example, just reaffirmed the 194 resolution, but it didn't do that. It didn't do that for a very good reason, and that's what I'm trying to drive at. These regions where you see the conceptual shifts throughout the times, these conceptual shifts in the notion of self-determination and how the resolutions are taken, they don't happen by chance. They don't happen by accident. They are designed, they are specifically designed to justify certain practices and to undermine certain narratives at the leverage and leverage others. So, for example, the 1967 resolutions for the refugees stated that these refugees, that Israel should, that basically both parties should negotiate an acceptable agreement to the question of the refugees that were generated, the second mass wave that was generated after 96. So what does this mean? Coming to an agreeable, for example, resolution, and from then on, this means that given, and calling for these refugees to go back to the 1967 borders. So what does this mean? This means that United Nations resolutions post the Naksa, which are, 242, 338, effectively nullified UN Resolution 194, because when UN resolution 338 and 248 and 242 say that Palestinians have to the right to go back to the Palestinian borders in 1967, specifically 67, turning a complete blind eye on the refugees that were generated in 1948, what the United Nations is saying that is turning a blind eye on the question of the refugee Palestinians in 1948. So what does this mean? Why is this very, very important to consider? And the reason why this is going to become more and more and more important to consider, as I will explain later, is because it's important to consider because it helps us evaluate contemporary discourses, contemporary advocacy efforts. Like, for example, let's say I want to evaluate the BDS movement, okay? The BDS movement, the reason why this BDS, and I am under no circumstances whatsoever undermining all the great achievements that the BDS movement has established. I am an avid supporter of BDS. I check all my things before I buy. I believe in a strategy, in a boycott divestment movement, and I believe that it's important to for as part of a strategy or technique for liberation. However, the movement itself established its legality or framework within the same framework as the UN resolutions post 1967. So, because it completely argues, for example, that, we are against the occupation of Palestine. And by occupation of Palestine, they mean to say the Palestinians of the 1967. But what about the Palestinians of 1948? Let's say we resolved the issue of the Palestinian refugees of 1947, okay? Does this mean that there will no longer a Palestinian struggle for liberation? No, it won't. And what it also does, it also shifts focuses. And this is why I say it's very important to be mindful of how you question this notion of the Palestinian question. Because increasingly, Israel has been, for example, classified as an apartheid. Right? So they are trying to explain what's happening as apartheid policies. But what this discourse fails to acknowledge is that apartheid is a symptom of settler colonialism. And it's not, and by itself, it does not explain the Gaza event. Apartheid policies do not explain genocide. Apartheid policies will not explain the tactic of starvation. These are, the wall barrier does, restricting movement perhaps does, but those are all part and parcel of what a settler colonial framework is more properly able to explain. So if, let's say, the dominant discourse on question framing is going to be that of post 1967, then we are basically setting ourselves for failure, because we have to go back after that issue is resolved. We have to go back to try to resolve the issue of the Palestinians of 1948, who their descendants are estimating about 10 million people in the diaspora. These people have rights, right? But they're not talked about. Even the Palestinian Authority does not address that question and fails to address the question. And the reason why it fails to address the question is because it shifted its priorities from supporting the Palestinian liberation in the early years post the 1948 until the mid-70s, where the PLO, for example, supported resistance movements out of Lebanon and everywhere else. And after that, it became, and after the 1967 defeat, when the PLO, the Palestinians wanted to take basically lead of their own question, and asked for the PLO to be the legal representative, the only legal and authoritative and legal representations to represent the Palestinian people, the Palestinian leadership, the PLO, became more consumed with stabilizing its foundation and mainly basically cultivating the financial support of the various regimes, which meant what? Which meant now decisions, the PLO's decisions, are going to have to appease those who are actually giving it money to sustain itself. So the PLO itself became encompassed in the same structure of dominance that it sought to actually resist. So you can see, for example, a significant shift after the Gulf War, for example, after the PLO, for example, sided with Iraq. You know, there has been a decreasing amount of support, and you can see all of these things. For example, from the 1960s to 1980s, we had a unified understanding of self-determination. Now, self-determination and the notion of the refugees' right, once the PLO became consumed with sustainability and became consumed of maintaining its power, relation place in the discourse, it started to marginalize on the Palestinian quest for liberation, and we see that through and through. And especially, we see that after the Oslo agreement. After Oslo, there was a point in time where no Palestinian leadership whatsoever would have dared to compromise on the refugees' right of return home. The refugees' right of return home is the center, it's the crux of the Palestinian question. So, but after the Oslo Accord, the leadership started talking of a more realistic, more pragmatic approach, advocating that there is no way that the Palestinians of 1948 refugees can go back to their homes, which apparently the United Nations had actually gave them the right to, and that realistically, if there ever was to have a right, if there ever was to be an achieved right of return for the Palestinian refugees, they would have to take place within what they classify as the borders of Palestine. A two-state solution, which we all know is not even feasible at this point for so many different reasons. So again, the reason why I am emphasizing this is because it's very important to understand, like if we frame the question of the Palestinian struggle from an apartheid framework, for example, this could be actually, it's beneficial. It should be thought of as a part of a collective strategy for liberation, that would take, let's say, resistance, actual resistant acts together, and like, for example, where motivation, like it will maximize on, for example, activism, support activism and so forth. It should be a part, but apartheid, framing the question of Palestine as apartheid, can, in the overall run, if not recast back to its settler colonial framework, which properly explains the genocide, because I don't know if some of you know, but the proper definition of settler colonialism maintains that it's a form of structure, a governing structure that is built on the replacement of one people with an important another. So the settler colonialism itself as a framework is based on the logic of genocide. So if we understand this, if we understand the kind of structural formation of this state, you know, if we recast the question of Palestine to its settler colonial framework, we can then achieve a true liberation by dismantling this unjust, unfair, illegal establishment. Thank you.
Thank you so much for all three of our panelists. We recognize we're getting close to time, so we'll actually be going until about 7:15. But just to be respectful of anyone's time, if anyone wants to leave, please feel free to do so. But we will be taking some time for a moderated Q&A as well as some audience questions. So, you know, if you need to leave, please feel free at any time. My name is Lean. I am the Community Outreach Coordinator at the Arab American Heritage Council, and I'll be asking one question right now, and then we'll also take it to the audience to gather a couple more questions, and if time permits, I'll ask a couple more. So if you have questions, prepare them now. Again, thank you all so much for your presentations today. Not only were they very informative, but of course, I think I can speak for a lot of us here and say that they were particularly heavy. And not only because, of course, the content is heavy, but because we are all able to take that content and relate it to what we're seeing on our phones on a day-to-day basis. And coming from a community organization like the AHC, we're very aware of the ways that that accessibility to that knowledge and that ability to relate this content to horrific footage that we're coming out of the Middle East, of course, that is shaping the way that we're having these conversations. And I wanted to ask you all specifically about the impact of that on whether it's in your educational spaces, your institutions, the way that people are talking about this, public perception, international law. What does that look like? How has that changed? You all have been doing this work for a long time. And at least for me, in my lifetime, it's the first time that we're seeing such in-your-face undeniability of what's happening, and not only facts, but also human impact. So I wanted to see what that has looked like for you all.
I'm being given the microphone because I've probably in the panel been around the longest to see these changes. Sure, you know, the atmosphere in the United States in the Cold War was extremely pro-Israeli because as things turned out, you know, in the Cold War, it was teams and people chose up sides. And so Cairo didn't start out that way, but over time, the Gamal Abdel Nasser government increasingly tilted towards Moscow. And since Israel in turn tilted heavily towards Washington, and the American public sided heavily with Israel. Hadn't always been the case. I think in the 1956 war, President Eisenhower was furious with Ben-Gurion over his attack on Egypt and made him give back the Sinai Peninsula. But by the 1967 war, the United States was a cheering section for the Israeli war effort. I remember the atmosphere was such that we had Rowan and Martin's Laugh-In. It was the predecessor of, you know, Saturday Night Live comedic news. And they were doing jokes after the 67 war. And they said, used Egyptian rifles only dropped once. Today it was announced that Israel and Egypt would join and become one country. The name of the new country, Israel. So those were the kinds of popular culture references that were being made. And to be pro-Palestinian was very difficult in that era, or even to acknowledge the Palestinians was very difficult. So this has changed enormously. One of the things that happened was from 1967, the immigration laws changed in the United States. In 1924, we instituted Nazi-style immigration laws, which were envisaged as ensuring the white character of the country. There was an Asian Exclusion Act. Syria, Lebanon were given a quota of 400 per year. So in 1965, after the Civil Rights Movement, Congress finally became ashamed of itself and established an upper limit of 25,000 per country in the world. This upper limit is not usually met by most countries, but the way the law was phrased, I think, benefited the Muslim communities in the world, because there are 56 Muslim majority countries, and then there are lots of countries that have substantial Muslim minorities, whereas I think China and India were done dirty by this law because they're just one of them. And so we've seen a demographic change. I think in 1965, there were only 100,000 Muslim Americans. Some of them were African American members of the Nation of Islam. Others were immigrants, or the children of immigrants. But now we have nearly 4 million, according to the Pew Charitable Trust, Muslim Americans. And it may be more, because I think a lot of Muslims are from countries where if someone official calls you and says, "What's your religion?" you hang up. We may not be capturing all of them, but in any case, they have achieved a voice and are a factor. They played a role in the uncommitted vote here in Michigan in the Democratic primary, so as to send a signal to the White House that it's, I think Joe Biden is from an older generation that, he began his career in the early 70s from Delaware, and he's not really in tune with these demographic changes in the country and the changes in mood that it has brought. So I think that's part of the reason for the different point of view on these matters. I think the Israeli public also has shifted further and further to the right. Some of this has to do with immigration to Israel on a large scale from Eastern European countries and Russia, and the rise of the ultra-Orthodox Jewish community, which has gone from 2% to 14% of the population, and apparently may become much more. Frankly, the politics espoused by the Israeli establishment have become unlovely in the eyes of many Americans. It's harder to apologize for them. And then finally, we're living in the world. I was struck by the phrase, seeing it on our phones. When I grew up, you could look at your phone a long time and wouldn't see much. But I think that's the world we now live in, that although attempts were made by the Israelis to cut Gaza off from the internet, they failed for various reasons, and even from electricity. But people are using solar panels, and they're using workarounds, and they're able to get these images out. And what's happening in Gaza is truly horrific. I mean, the October 7th attacks by the Hamas militants on Israelis were horrific. I mean, it's sometimes said, well, people have a right to defend themselves from occupation. And yes, if Hamas had struck military facilities alone, there could be a question about whether it was a legitimate action in international law. But they went to a music peace festival and mowed down people and so forth. That was horrific. And for a time, it set the tone of the Western response of these events. But the Israeli far right-wing government, the most extreme government Israel has ever had, its response to that attack was to use it really as a pretext to carry out what is now widely being seen as a genocide. And if you followed the Israeli parliament, there were people saying this before, that we should find a way to get rid of the Gazans entirely. So then they seem to be deciding to try to do that. But we've seen it. Well, at least some of us have seen it. Apparently, there's a distinction in the American public between the older people who watch CNN and read the New York Times, and they don't see it. But then the young people are watching TikTok and watching their phones, and they've been seeing the war unfold in real time. And what they've seen is not something that any human being with a conscience could support.
Thanks, Juan. How is it affecting our daily life? How is it affecting student life? I teach a course on genocide in the 20th century, and I taught that in October of last year. And when I walked into the classroom on exactly October 8th, I never imagined that I would now sit here and talk about a genocide happening on our phones, in our living rooms, in our lives. It has tremendously disrupted, in a good way, in many ways, our consciousness, I think. When I think about how is it affecting students, it's exhausting. I see students being exhausted as they are trying to make their voices heard on campus, and are being arrested, told not to disrupt business as usual, as the administration is turning its back on Palestinian and Muslim students who are trying to really just be heard on campus. It's unprecedented in many ways, and maybe it's not so unprecedented. This student activism that we see on campus is continuous, and it's strong, and it's resilient, and it's trying to be heard. And this is affecting students' everyday life, I think, very much. And I think just watching what's unfolding in Gaza is simply exhausting everyone, but everyone is sort of also trying to make sure that this moment is not to be unnoticed. And we see, of course, the demonstrations continuously. The vote in Michigan was instrumental, of course. When we think historically, of course, we sit here and we think, okay, how can this happen? And the world is standing by, so to speak. But the world has stood by many times. In the 1990s, Rwanda was happening on the TV screens. Everybody knew it, everybody watched it, but nobody intervened. And so it's not necessarily something new. What is different here, I think, is what scholars and legal scholars have called the Palestinian exception, right? That comes with the fear of speaking out for Palestine. And you can see that, of course, on campuses as faculty is being censored. There's a lot of self-censorship. People don't want to talk about it because you can be doxxed, you end up on Campus Watch, and so on. So there's a lot of self-censorship, I think, that is the result of what is called the Palestinian exception, which didn't happen 6 months ago, but the Palestinian exception has been going on for many, many years, where people who are speaking out against the policies of Israel, against the Palestinian and against the occupation are not promoted, sanctioned. Some have lost their jobs. And so this is very difficult. It's a very difficult moment. And one, I'm sure many of my colleagues are thinking, what do I say and what don't I say? And where does it go? And who will know? And so there's a lot of that as well among faculty and stuff.
I'm going to be brief. Yes, the question of Palestine changed my life and continues to change my life. During the first Intifada, which took place in 1987, I remember how it broke out. I remember seeing images on TV with Israeli Defense Forces grabbing a couple of Palestinians, holding a rock and actively breaking their hands, because it's the iron fist strategy at that point. And then the first Intifada erupted. At that time, I was still coming of age. And that was the first time I have ever seen the Palestinian flag. I went to my parents asking, what the hell is going on? What is this all about? I didn't even know we were occupied. I didn't know anything. The Palestinian flag, any symbol of nationalism, was forbidden under Israeli governance. So I was like mesmerized about the fact that, hey, I belong to a nation that I didn't even know about. And part of it, of course, has to do with gender roles, in the sense that we women, women have no place in politics, and I was very young. So after that, I became, I started becoming active in high school, and I was hanging at that. My family came from an upper middle class, and it was a missionary, basically, school, private Christian school. So that that didn't go very well with some upper class perspectives that thought my activism was not proper and somewhat like, why are you doing this or whatever. So I began losing friendships from them. Moving on to college, I met some of the most brightest minds until my present day. And one of the main reasons is student activism. And these are the peoples, the relationships that I cultivated at Bethlehem University changed my life. And I don't know if many of you know, but when young Palestinians, engage in active resistance, student organizing or whatever, when they're jailed in the Israeli various Palestinian military jails, they turn those military jails into high-end educational institutions. A person who leaves there is heavily informed on theoretical perspectives, historical perspectives, theories, whether it's Marxist theory, because you have a lot of the segments of the PLO factions that are based in Marxist theory. Amazing. So of course, once those relations began to take place, my parents did not like it, which basically facilitated for my coming to the U.S. To continue my education, get married, and so forth. And so in that sense, it affected my life again. How it affects my life right now, I would say that it affects my life right now by education again and again and again. It is the more educated you are, not only that the more educated you are, sometimes you feel the more you feel like you don't know anything, and it drives you to keep on knowing, but it also gives you that stamina. It foregrounds you in a solid belief in the just cause of activism. And my years at the AHC, when I worked there, solidified that role. So I think when you are very well informed, it's hard not to actually take the right position in history and not to be afraid to be subordinated into silence. And, silencing, this discourse of silencing is very, very detrimental to both the Palestinian cause and us as a community. But more importantly, I became even more determined to become activist once I started seeing that increasingly the question of Palestine has been framed as this part of the greater Muslim questions, quote unquote, clash of civilization. That's when I became furious. Not only that this clash of civilization narrative is very, very racist and discriminatory, but it actually acts as a prerequisite for justifying discriminative and violent actions, not only in Palestine, but also here in the US. For example, when people are going to classify my kids just because they're Arab, or my kids' advocacy in terms of a Muslim question, it's okay to inflict harm on somebody who's Muslim, and this Muslim narrative has been vilified. This is why, the assault on Gaza would not have happened if Israel did not do such a great job in establishing Palestinian resistance as this barbaric Muslim whatever, rather than taking it from, rather than actually, explaining it from, a policy standpoint, a structural policy standpoint that is subject to settler colonialism. So it has practical implications. Words have practical implications. When you vilify Muslims, you're justifying harm, period.
Thank you, everyone. I think we have time for one or two audience questions, and then I have a closing out question. So if you have a question from the audience, raise your hand, and we'll be coming around with microphones.
I'll repeat the question. The question, the audience member wanted to know how it could be stopped, how the U.S. government supply of arms to Israel could be stopped. Well, I'm afraid to say that the studies all show that Americans buy peanut butter much more intelligently than they vote. When they buy the peanut butter, they look to see what's in it and how much does it cost compared to other brands of peanut butter, and what are they really getting for their dollar. When they vote, they seem to put crazy people in Congress. People like, well, there would be so many to name. So, the answer to your question is that the way that you would change American foreign policy in the Middle East, and including arms sales, would be for the American people to put more rational actors in Congress, and to have people who were less beholden to special interests. Unless there's a grassroots movement to do that, we've seen this movie go on now for 75 years. There's nothing more popular in Congress than arms sales to U.S. allies, not just Israel. There's the United Arab Emirates and Saudi Arabia and so forth. And what bad thing could happen? They feel like they're employing Americans at these arms factories, and will help them to get reelected if people are employed, and then the big arms companies give them money for their political campaigns. So within that circle of high politics and finance and commerce, it makes perfect sense for the U.S. to be doing what it's doing. But I had a colleague who's passed on now, David Singer, who was a political scientist, and he tried to do a study of what causes wars to break out, and he couldn't find very many statistical correlations for the outbreak of wars through history. The one thing that seemed to have some correlation was that one of the countries involved in the war had recently made large purchases of nice new shiny weapons. That seemed to be associated with the outbreak of war. And if you think about it, you know, if you're in that position that you've just bought the new weapons and you have a lot of them, that's an advantageous position, but it won't last. Eventually, your opponents will also get up to speed. So only if you use them quickly would you get the full benefit of them from the point of view of the warmongering class. These arms sales that the Americans make in the Middle East, and not just America, Russia, France, China increasingly, probably are actually contributing to the outbreak of the wars, which then demand more arms sales and so forth. That system makes sense at a certain level of American society. It's very bad for the rest of us, unless the rest of us organize to put in more sane people, it will go on.
Yeah, let's take one more.
My comment is very quick. This question is usually answered on two fronts. The first, which Professor Juan Cole generously explained. The first dimension is by voting, changing American discourse by voting. And the second explanation is through activism. While I do not discount any of these elements, I think the question of how we can change American policy when it comes to the support of Israel needs to start by assessing whether change can come from within to begin with. Meaning, can change come from within the same established framework, let's say voting, voting can change, can real change, real transformative change happen from within the same discourse? There's a very famous poet, her name is Audre Lorde, and she says that the master's tools do not basically dismantle the master's house. Liberalism and liberal democracy has been so good about transforming itself to basically avoid structural problems, the problems of representation. So whether or not change can come through voting remains, in my perspective, remains in question, because as a political scientist also as well, there's mounting amounts of research that proves that individual votes don't matter, especially because of the electoral system that we have in the US. So I believe that change happens by assessing that, change, by going back to question whether this attempt to try to do change from within the same legal boundaries can actually effectively, truly bring about true change, or is it just going to metaphors into something else still under the same, same framework? So that's what needs to be examination. We have to start, definitely if change happens from the outside, we have to start with confrontational politics.
So I actually have a question for Muna regarding your research question. I thought your research question was very informative, and it would definitely benefit other people that aren't quite informative on the topic. So to answer your research question in simple terms and for a better understanding for the people who aren't quite familiar with what is going on, how would you answer it for those people?
Can you just, how would I answer what exactly?
Your research question.
Okay. I would answer the research question about talking about the performative role of language or question framing, meaning as a new discourse of domination. And I would explain that based on Michel Foucault's understanding of a discourse analysis, which he basically explains shifts in, like, for example, conceptualization. Let's say we are going to trace the ontological shifts of the notion of self-determination from the onset of the Nakba until our present day. We do a discourse-based analysis where each period, each time period undergoes specific changes, specific changing power dynamics that also influence and change the way language, the meaning of language themselves. So we have now self-determination, for example, throughout the early 1920s, when it was, the time of the fall of empire and the nation state building, self-determination was established as a collective right. It was understood actually from the socialist beginnings of the notion of the collective right of anti-colonial struggles of self-determination. Recently, like we see, for example, human rights discourse has been more criticized. We have scholarships like Morin, like Hunt. They provide an ontological approach to tracing the conceptual understanding, and they show how it changed from this collective anti-colonial understanding of self-determination to the new modern Wilsonian understanding of self-determination. Because post the Second World War, when the United States came out as a triumphant leader as a global power, Wilson announced that this notion of self-determination framed this notion of self-determination differently, framed it from a more reduced notion of individualistic understanding of self-determination. So then the question of Palestine becomes understood not from the collective understanding of the rights of the people to self-determination, but it becomes this Palestinian right of return. It becomes the collective history of anti-colonial struggles is reduced to legalities, to matter of legalities that basically blindside settler colonialism. And for a very good reason. That's precisely what it's designed to do. So when you reduce it, when you fragment this notion of the collective notion of self-determination, you actually fragment the liberation movement itself. So language has real power. If anything, be careful on how you frame your when you're trying to actually explain the Palestinian question. Settler colonialism, settler colonialism, settler colonialism. What settler colonialism mean? Give a comparative analysis to the United States of America. That's, it's conflicting narratives. It's about conflicting narratives, settler colonialism, and if you highlight that and you show that Palestine remains the one region in the world where this national quest for self-determination yet remains to be achieved, then you may be able to at least entice them to read more about it.
We'll do one more audience question. One more audience question.
Presented the 100 years of history, very clear, very simple, and about the history of the conflict. Why did it take almost 5% of the population in Gaza to be killed or injured to be an eye-opener for the educated Western world? Right? Now, I'm sympathizing with the Gaza and the Palestinians it is so clear that these Israeli entities have been doing what Muna was talking about since 1948. Why do you take such a tragedy for people now to say, wow, young people now are sympathizing, people are understanding? It doesn't take any time to figure it out. I mean, it's very simple. You can, from a historic point of view, why the intellectuals, even intellectuals in a university, the big universities, are pro-Israel. Even the medical, I'm a medical doctor, even the AMA, the American Medical Association, Genesee County Medical Society, they were against ceasefire. Why the intellectual still cannot see it?
So the question is, given the shape of the history that I presented, why has my historical work been so little accepted in the wider world? And this point of view has been a minority point of view in so many halls of power and even among publics. Well, first of all, it's a matter of voice to a large extent, I think. Jews after the Holocaust were accorded a voice, as they should be. They were genocided, and people would listen to them. They were a sympathetic community. They, in Europe, in the United States, there were minorities, and they had a conversion. Most Jews were not Zionists in the early 20th century, and many American Jews were very anti-Zionist. But after the news of the Holocaust broke, over the next few years, and certainly by the 1960s and 70s, the majority in the American Jewish community, and I think this was true of most of the Jewish communities in Europe, attached themselves to Zionism. They saw the existence of Israel and the project of Israel as essential for the safety of and the welfare of the Jewish minority communities throughout the world. They made this argument. People like Joe Biden have accepted it. He says, I'm a Zionist. If he says that if Israel didn't exist, then no Jew would be safe. Since he's the president of the United States, it seems to me like he's the one who should be guaranteeing the safety of his citizens who are of Jewish heritage. But he's forwarded that responsibility, apparently, to Benjamin Netanyahu. So I think that's part of it, is that the Jews had a voice, and then the Jews, many of them became Zionists, and the Zionists had a voice. And the Palestinians didn't have a voice. They were refugees. The first generation after the Nakba, when they were expelled from their homes, they were shell-shocked. They were living in camps. They didn't have any property. And it's only gradually that the new generation in the late 60s began finding a voice and being able to speak out. But even then, it was a small affair in global world terms. And so, I just think that what's happening now is that because of the egregiousness of the situation, because Netanyahu destroyed the Oslo peace accords, which were very imperfect, but nevertheless, would have been a starting place for some kind of peace in the region, the situation is looking increasingly hopeless. I mean, as we speak, what hope is there really for a resolution of these problems, for a dignified and safe life for Palestinians, for Jews in that part of the world? I blame the American establishment for kicking the can down the road and not taking this issue so seriously as to try to resolve it. We're a superpower. If we wanted to resolve it, we probably could. So I think what's happened now, however, is that the Palestinians, Arabs, people of the global South, and so forth have attained a voice, are being accorded more of a legitimacy to speak. And then I think that there's an opinion shift among Western liberals who had been also Zionist, really, and they're beginning to rethink that stance. And I disagree profoundly with those Zionists and those partisans of Israel who see this as a danger to the state of Israel. Because I think the real danger to the state of Israel was for people like Biden to allow it to fall into the hands of Itamar Ben-Gvir and Bezalel Smotrich and Benjamin Netanyahu, who are the equivalent of the captains of the Titanic.
Hang on. I think in addition to all of what you're just saying, the establishment of the academy has not been necessarily friendly to the Palestinian voice. When you think, how do we study regions? How do we study particular histories? This comes with funding. You can probably count the Centers for Palestine Studies in the US on one hand. There's two. But of course, the programs for Holocaust studies and genocide studies are numerous. And so the Palestinian voice has been marginalized in the academy, and academic freedom and free speech on campuses, as we are witnessing now, is something that is valued, something that we think about as our ethical stance, that our research and our teaching is based on expertise. It's based on what we know well, and that we should be allowed to talk about it freely. But when it comes to Palestine, that academic freedom is not so clear. It's often questioned, right? Free speech is questioned when it comes to that particular thing, right? Academic freedom is what we all love and value, but when it comes to Palestine, it's perhaps less that, or it's easily taken away.
I concur, but I just want to add, since my training is in political theory, I want to add a theoretical dimension to what's been already stated. I would actually argue that unfortunately, it's not just the Western academia, it's also the Arab academia. And the reason behind this has to do with what I would actually classify as the production of colonial knowledge. This establishment of, this is what Edward Said was talking about when he established in his book Orientalism, when he established basically a new discourse for the political sciences to analyze things like the Palestinian question. So the problem becomes in the fact is that the educational institutions are part and parcel, and not only part and parcel, but also implicit in the development and solidification of the particular Israeli narrative. And one of the main reasons why this was able to do it is through Israel's successful attempt or propaganda to advance itself or to project itself as a Western, a Western democracy amongst hostile Arab nations. So, and the other part, of course, becomes where Arab scholars are guilty about adopting certain standardized Western approaches to academia, to analyzing, because apparently, if they don't oblige or constrain themselves within these Western standards, then their scholarship has no merit, right? So it has to do not only with the production of the colonial knowledge on Palestinians, which privileges the Israeli narrative at the expense of the Palestinians, but this discourse is also solidified, unfortunately, by Arab scholars implicit in solidifying that. Let's not forget that some of our renowned scholars that some of them have been mentioned today were advisors to the PLO Oslo Accord. It wasn't till after the disastrous failure of Oslo that they came out with scholarship arguing that they were against it. But the reason they were pro two-state solutions, They were pro-marginalizing on refugee rights and the right of return. So they are the ones also, not they are the ones, but they are implicit in solidifying the colonial knowledge that was produced on the question of Palestine.
I will just ask one more question to wrap up the event, but I do want to invite the audience to come up to the panelists and ask questions after, but just for the interest of time, I'm going to ask this one question. I just want to say that you all mentioned a little bit about like campus environment as we speak. Students at the University of Michigan, Ann Arbor are striking today and joining national organizations to push their institutions to divest. So today, as we speak, some footage is coming out. There's a Tahrir coalition, Tahrir standing for freedom, that they've started to push universities in that way. And coming from the Arab American Heritage Council, I just wanted to ask you all, what opportunities do you see within grassroots organizations and movements that are happening, whether on college campuses and otherwise, really for advancing Palestinian rights and amplifying Palestinian on the local and global voices, right? We talked about how Palestinians have been silenced and have been silenced for a long time. So what role do these movements have in amplifying the voices that now, again, like I mentioned, are undeniably loud?
I'm going to be very short. Huge role, but mainly in trying to go against this grain of silencing, silencing that, that we are, as if the Palestinian cause for liberation does not have the right to stand on its own, that you have to associate it, for example, with different narratives to make it more justified. So silencing. But let me say this: the liberation of Palestine is not going to come from activism. The liberation of Palestine is not going to come through BDS movement. The liberation of Palestine is not going to come through resistance alone. The liberation of Palestine is going to come through the collectiveness of these three, public support, activism, having a community that is embracing of and protecting of resistance, and also, of course, through initiatives like BDS.
Oh, just really quickly. So Ann Arbor campus is on strike today and is picketing various buildings, and the Tahrir coalition has been very active. And when we look at social activism, and we've talked about this many times on Ann Arbor campus, when we look at the history of social activism, activism can make change. The University of Michigan students in the 1960s demonstrated for a decade against South African apartheid and asked the university to divest from South Africa. The university did divest eventually. The Black Action Movement on campus protested, set in organized teach-ins for decades over the years of the 60s, 70s, and into the 90s, and accomplished a great deal. We have now a program that teaches about the history of Black Americans. And so there's great change that can happen through social activism. And so in that sense, even though the activities of the administration is trying to crack down on disruptive activities on campus, the idea is that, or I would say, if we look historically, and the university and its administration prides itself enormously on the social activism and the history of social activism. And so it can make a change, and yeah.
Well, let me address a different corner of this question of change on campuses, which is that I think that the Arab American and Muslim American communities are becoming sufficiently numerous and mature enough that they should start thinking about some endowments. Because we need, for instance, an endowed chair, the Edward Said Chair of Palestinian Studies at the University of Michigan. Such a thing exists at Columbia, but we don't have it at Michigan. Often groups in American civil society gain more of a voice through these endowments, which everybody admits are legitimate. So I don't think that Armenian history and the Armenian issue would have the same profile in the United States as it does, had it not been for a string of important endowments at major universities in the area of Armenian studies, including at the University of Michigan. So I understand, many Arab Americans and Muslim Americans are relatively recent immigrants or second or third generation, and they put a lot of money into building their own institutions. Mosques had to be built, community centers, and there was a kind of turn inward to the community's needs. But I think they're now achieving the kind of stature in American society where it's legitimate for them to think about how could they influence their wider environment. And this is one of the proven ways of doing so.
Thank you so much to our panelists. Thank you so much to our audience. As a University of Michigan alumna, I'm very, very happy to have taken part in an event like this. I really appreciate the organizers for helping us put this on. Thank you, everyone. And like I said, there's a little bit more food outside, so feel free to serve yourself and come up to the panelists, ask questions, all of that. Thank you so much.